got to meet you, then we will introduce ourselves, then we'll go to work.
All right, we are from Reno High. We're from Reno, Nevada. I am Alexis Fisher, and I will be attending University of Nevada, Reno.
I am Tyler Ward. I will be attending the University of Nevada, Reno.
I'm Elise McMurtry. I will be attending the University of Nevada, Reno. I would also like to introduce our other teammate, Daniela Tapia, who unfortunately could not be here today. Our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark, and our unit coach is Mr. Carlin.
Terrific. We'll let them get settled. Go ahead.
By way of introduction, my name is Barry Anderson. I'm an Associate Justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Michael Galgano, Professor of History at James Madison University.
Sue Leeson, Senior Justice, Oregon Supreme Court. Unit 1, today we are doing question 3. I will read it while you get your notes out. It was through the drafting of these state constitutions that Americans first developed principles of constitutionalism and republicanism that were then adopted at the federal level. Do you agree or disagree with this assertion of an American scholar? Why or why not? When the colonists found themselves nearly in a state of nature after 1775, why did they feel compelled to promptly write state constitutions? Most state constitutions reflected a belief in legislative supremacy. Why? What arguments for and against legislative supremacy do you make?
In his Rights of Man, Thomas Paine wrote, "A constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government." Upon drafting state constitutions, Americans in newly freed and independent states first developed their expectations for democracy, such as popular sovereignty, limited government, and the protection of natural rights. These democratic ideals would later be mimicked in writing the U.S. Constitution.
While principles of constitutionalism and republicanism were not originally developed by state constitutions, John Dennon was correct in that they were formalized in these documents and then adopted at the federal level. Proportional representation, an aspect of republicanism, had an early application in the Virginia House of Burgesses, where the council consisted of 2 burgesses out of every town, hundred, or plantation.
This system was solidified in the Virginia Constitution, where the House of Delegates had representatives apportioned by county. Exclusion of this tenet in the Articles of Confederation resulted in its fulfillment in Article 1, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. A principle of constitutionalism, checks and balances, existed prior to state constitutions in the New York Charter, where the royal governor had the power to veto any bills passed by the Assembly.
Upon writing the Massachusetts Constitution, John Adams wrote that it is by balancing each power, legislative, executive, or judicial, against the other two, that the effort in human nature toward tyranny can alone be checked. These checks and balances were adopted into our Constitution, as for the power of the executive to curb that of the legislature in Article 2.
It was not necessarily a state of nature, but a state of emergency that propelled states to create constitutions post-1775 to solidify revised forms of government to maintain state sovereignty. Following the Declaration of Independence, British colonial charters were discontinued. Only state assemblies and committees had retained authority through popular consent, thus creating limited government. Acknowledging Emer de Vattel's idea that a sovereign government is one that protects natural rights, states, beginning with Virginia, included a Declaration of Rights in their constitutions.
These declarations guaranteed what have been known as the rights of Englishmen in the Magna Carta, something the colonists believed they deserved, including due process, writ of habeas corpus, and property rights. This would later be reflected in the Bill of Rights that ultimately allowed for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Through these constitutions, each state was able to act as what Justice Louis D. Brandeis termed laboratories of democracy, implementing state sovereignty.
Conflicts between the colonists, the royal governors, and the British monarch led to the Revolution, rendering the states cautious of a strong executive and favorable towards legislative supremacy. In 1927's J.W. Hampton versus the U.S., Congress was given certain control of executive officers' public regulations, continuing the idea that legislative power is a check upon the executive. Furthermore, as expressed by John Locke in his second treatise on government, legislative supremacy provides for the authenticity of the social contract, for there remains still in the people supreme power to remove or alter a legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in legislators.
However, as has been seen by the 112th Congress' failure to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, and the Senate's recent lack of votes to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act, Controversy within a powerful legislature slows the progress of society. This was further emphasized by the 2013 government shutdown.
Through constitutions, states were able to create independent governments to comply with specific public standards of constitutionalism and republicanism particular to each. Dual constitutionalism was formed when the Constitution not only adopted these principles, but also endorsed the idea of state sovereignty through the 10th Amendment. Thank you.
I enjoyed your discussion of legislative supremacy. Was there anything in the colonial experience and those early state constitutions with legislative supremacy that would cause us any concern about the impact of legislative supremacy on personal liberty, individual liberty, the kinds of things that the Federal Bill of Rights ultimately protected us against?
Well, during the Constitutional Convention, George Mason actually ended up walking out of the convention because he believed that the founding fathers were not protecting individual rights enough. Without a Bill of Rights in the federal Constitution, he believed that states could change individual rights however they thought was necessary, including getting rid of their individual rights altogether.
Furthermore, in the Articles of Confederation, an extreme legislative supremacy was created because the colonists were so fearful of a strong executive from the Revolution that they wanted to be connected to the branch of government that was going to control them. But ultimately, this proved to not be successful.
A question here, I'd like you to explore some of the differences between some of the state constitutions as they evolve. You make the point that they're all concerned with legislative supremacy or more with that than other things. What are some of the things that distinguish them, or are they 13 documents that are virtually identical?
Well, the Massachusetts Constitution used Montesquieu's idea of separation of powers. They used checks and balances between the three branches of government in order to ensure that the government was functioning how it should.
The Delaware Constitution was unique in that it adopted an almost parliamentary system of legislative supremacy in which the legislature had complete or almost complete control over the executive in terms of how much money he could use and the actions he could perform.
One of the largest reasons for the founders creating the Bill of Rights was because only 3 states actually allowed the right to freedom of speech, those being Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania.
I'm really puzzled, I guess, by your notion of the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution relative to the state constitutions. Every state constitution had a Bill of Rights. 7 of them, it's Article 1, which places a much stronger limitation on legislative action, arguably, than if it had been located in a different place. Your notion that rights in states were mutable somehow, I need to hear more about that.
Well, if you look at the form of government prior to the Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation.
I'm saying the state governments.
Yes.
Well, I'm staying focused with the question, which is on state constitution.
Yes,
Why do you think those rights are so mutable?
The states were allowed to create their own laws, and so they had ultimate power over how the individuals acted. And so each state had these individual laws and different type of rules. So when going to other states, they didn't know the laws, or they were subject to new laws. So the federal government saw it necessary that there should be an overall gap or overall protection of individual rights, so there wasn't this disconnect between states.
The Federalists believed that all the provisions included in state constitutions' Bill of Rights would be covered by articles in the Constitution, such as Article 6, which provides some sort of religious freedom. However, the Anti-Federalists believed that a Bill of Rights was necessary because they were fearful of the supremacy clause in the Constitution.
Right, and that seems to be contradictory what Tylo just said, so I'm still a little bit confused, but we'll explore it more in a bit. Go ahead.
We know that the British Constitution is unwritten. Why were the colonists so dead set on writing constitutions? This is really sort of a new thing. What prompts this?
Well, the essence of the Constitution, Little C Constitution, it sets out the form and structure of a government, and the colonists needed a structure in order to provide for the common good of their nation.
So why did Rhode Island and Connecticut adopt constitutions if they were so necessary?
After the creation of the Constitution, they did end up making their own state constitutions. Every state had its individual aspects to them, and they all had a different type of government controlling their states. And so they might not have felt the need to create these state constitutions, but each state ended up actually making one after the federal constitution.
The colonists were also fearful of the fluidity that they saw with the English Constitution. For example, the Magna Carta was ignored for 400 years and it had to be repeated through the English Bill of Rights and Petition of Rights. They were fearful of this and wanted one solid written constitution that they could turn back to.
Also, if you look at the literacy rate of the American colonies at the time, we had over a 90% literacy rate. So we were one of the most knowledgeable countries in the world. And starting with the Mayflower Compact, the people had this thought that there should be a written document to protect the people.
Were there any experiences with state constitutions that prompted the founders to take a different approach at the federal level?
Well, you could definitely see the struggle of power with the small state and the large state plans. They both had different aspects on how the government should rule, either proportional or equal, and they came up with the Connecticut and Connecticut Compromise on this, and they decided to rule on both with a bi-house legislature.
Bacon's Rebellion also made the founders fearful of a somewhat direct democracy or mob rule occurring, and so they put the Supremacy Clause into the Constitution to ensure that the federal power would be the one in control of everything.
Furthermore, Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison in a letter that the people have a right to a government that has a Bill of Rights in order to maintain their individual rights.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Some feedback. Would you like to start?
I'll start. I enjoyed the conversation. State constitutions are an interesting topic, and it is interesting to when you think about this sort of organic effort of drafting state constitutions, it sort of comes out of nowhere, and I think you touched on that quite well. One of the things I was driving at here, and it may reflect a lack of precision in my question, but when we look at what's happening at the state constitutional level and what happens at the federal constitutional level, there were concerns that that legislative supremacy might lead in a direction that could create, for example, a tyranny of the majority. Pennsylvania, for example, they adopted some forms of oaths that were required before you could participate. This was controversial, to say the least. And as you correctly noted, the founders in the Constitutional Convention were dealing with some of these issues. So that's an area that we could have explored a little bit more, but I think you did touch on it, and I thought it was quite good.
I think overall you did a very good job, both with the state constitutions and talking about their historical foundation. The point about Magna Carta is spot on, the role of the English Bill of Rights, which is really the first time the English do write things down indicating what the king can and cannot do. I think that was a very, very important point. I think I would have liked to have heard more discussion of some of the substantive differences among some of the state constitutions. I think you gave good examples, but there's some, not all of them agreed, for example, on a weak executive. I think that's a critical point and merits your future consideration and thought. But overall, I think a very, very good job.
This is a really tough question. I think you folks went at it with great intelligence and sophistication. I would push you in a couple of places. These were very much Lockean documents. You find social contract theory laid right out in Article 1 of most of the early state constitutions. The nature of that contract and the laying out of rights suggests that there are limits on the legislative that the people of the states want, and that has nothing to do with the federal constitution that comes later. That's going to be a whole different fight many years down the road. This question focuses on state constitutions, and exploring those documents in their own terms, I think, is really important. Yes, they were committed to written documents. They had written documents. They all had their crown charters. Connecticut and Rhode Island, charters are just fine. They seem to be serving the needs of our colony fine. We don't need to write anything more. Other states, no. We really are revolutionary. We want to have clearly Lockean documents, and so we will write our constitutions and we will lay out what we think are our fundamental rights, which then goes straight to the question on legislative supremacy. No, they don't believe in legislative supremacy. Notwithstanding strong legislatures, all of the constitutions put limits on legislative power through laying out their concept of right. Those are the kinds of things I'd love to see it develop more sharply, because I think those are the kinds of materials that help make the argument that you guys were really making, and did very, very well. You've given us tons to think about. It's a great way to start our morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.